Hello, and welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Today we look at the case of Carol and Scott Dawson, a mother and son who were jailed for the murder of Gary Dean. It was said in court that Carol and Scott Dawson had killed Gary Dean because he had took a route across their land to go running. His body was found in a ditch near his home in Barnsley in September of 2018. He had been shot in the back of the head with an air rifle and beaten with rocks. But what drove the mother and son to take the life of Mr Dean? And why are they both now appealing the sentences that they were given? Today we take a deeper look into the case and the appeal process. In all likelihood, Gary Dean, who was the victim, was on the autistic spectrum. He was a very fit man who was obsessional about running and cycling. He lived in Silkstone Common and often used the public footpath which belonged to Scott Dawson. This public footpath, which bordered on the Housecar Dyke, had access to the Trans-Pennine Trail. Scott Dawson had explained that he was using the land to develop a business, farming pigs, which were housed on a barn on the land. Gary Dean had an unusual and persistent habit of behaving in an antisocial manner, thereby causing significant annoyance. By way of example, he had a strong objection to horses being ridden on the local woodland paths, and during 2016 and 2017, he erected scarecrows to frighten the horses, and he stretched twine across some paths at a height designed to unseat the horsemen or women. His behaviour had resulted in multiple complaints by all the local residents. The Woodland Trust erected CCTV cameras, and the footage revealed Gary Dean defecating in the woods. He was then asked by the community support officers to stop going to the woods. Both Scott and Carol Dawson had made complaints to the police about Mr Dean's behaviour, which included allegations that he had damaged their property over a period of about 5 years. For instance, breaking windows and interfering with machinery. He once allegedly approached Carol Dawson with a hammer. He threatened to burn down Scott Dawson's barns containing the pigs. Scott and Carol Dawson maintained that as a result of their behaviour, it was necessary to keep someone to watch over the premises during the evening and overnight. It was suggested in the court that Mr Dean's behaviour had started to take a serious toll on the mother and son's health. Mr Dean was prosecuted for harassing Scott Dawson and damaging his property, along with using threatening words and behaviour towards Carol Dawson and also assaulting her. However, Mr Dean was acquitted on the 19th of February 2018 of all charges after a trial, but the Magistrates Court did impose a 3-year restraining order, a 3-year order restraining him from contacting Carol Dawson or Scott Dawson. Between the 3rd and the 6th of September 2018, there was a fire in the woods close to a site leading to Scott Dawson's field. The prosecution put forward that this may have been lit by Mr Dean, given the route that he regularly took. The prosecution's case was that Scott and Carol Dawson had acted together to assault Mr Dean. The attack took place sometime between 6:50 and 7:30 AM on the 6th of September 2018. It was alleged by the court that they were motivated by a desire of revenge, because they held Mr Dean responsible for various problems on Scott Dawson's land, which had caused him serious financial loss. Their campaign against Mr Dean, which had resulted in prosecution in the Magistrates Court, had failed, and it was suggested that Scott and Carol Dawson considered that the authorities had been unable to deal adequately with their complaints, and had decided to take matters into their own hands. There was no direct evidence against Scott Dawson or Carol Dawson, and the case was compromised by strands of circumstantial evidence. The prosecution alleged that this hostility started on the 18th of July 2017, when Scott Dawson had stated to the police telephone operator, "Now, if he's going to keep getting away with this, we all may as well do it to him." Other extracts from the telephone calls that they made to the police between June 2017 and January 2018 demonstrated that both Carol and Scott Dawson had showed frustration and anger towards the behaviour of Gary Dean, and the failure of the authorities to address it. Carol Dawson, perhaps tellingly, spoke of her annoyed son, and she suggested that somebody is going to get killed here, and expressed the opinion that the police were not reacting appropriately despite the reports made to them. Scott Dawson in turn spoke of taking matters into his own hands. They will be out because I'll be ripping him in fucking half. In a written complaint to the police in Carol Dawson's writing, signed by Scott Dawson, it stated that Mr Dean's behaviour was responsible for bringing Scott Dawson's business plans to a halt, and it stated that the stress this has caused me is unbelievable, emotionally and financially. Carol Dawson had also suggested that Mr Dean was grooming young women and was a predator of women, and had also pushed over an 82-year-old woman. She also accused Mr Dean of kicking a newborn lamb and had broken windows and had damaged gates. She had made these allegations to Mrs Dean and to the school where she worked. Text messages between Scott Dawson and his partner indicated a willingness to spend time waiting to catch and grab Gary Dean. Mr Dean had told police in an interview prior to his prosecution that he had been confronted by Scott Dawson in the woods, and that Scott Dawson had been hooded and wearing some sort of mask during the encounter. An air rifle was purchased on May of 2018, and the pellets that were lodged into the back of Mr Dean's spine, there had been a single penetrating gunshot wound to his back, had matched the pellets which were found in Carol Dawson's garage. Scott Dawson had initially lied when he denied to the police in an interview that he had purchased this weapon, a weapon which was never recovered. The fire and smoke in the woods, which was near to Scott Dawson's field, as was mentioned earlier, was seen in the court as the final thing which led to the attack of Mr Dean. Mr Dean's daily routine of running in the early morning after he left his wife for work was widely known in the local community. There had been internet research done by Scott Dawson 3 days before the murder as to the opening time of the school where Mr Dean's wife had worked, and also a photograph of Gary Dean was found at Scott Dawson's house. The Crown accepted that Carol Dawson had waited in a lay-by to signal her son when Mr Dean's wife had left home. Analysis of all the data of contact between Scott and Carol Dawson's telephones revealed that in the month prior to the murder, they had been in touch once or twice. But in contrast, on the 6th of September 2018, there were contacts or attempted contacts on 12 different occasions. Furthermore, Scott Dawson had purchased a new mobile and a SIM card on the 6th of September 2018, which then became a contact number used for communications between Scott and Carol Dawson. During the police interviews, Scott Dawson initially failed to mention this new telephone, but later said he had accidentally damaged his own telephone, which he had burnt in order to dispose of it. This was untrue. The old telephone that the police wanted was recovered from Carol Dawson's home address. At 5:30 PM on the 6th of September 2018, Simon Roberts found the body of Gary Dean in the house of Carr Dyke at Silkstone Common, near Barnsley. He had been brutally killed. The unchallenged evidence was that Mr Dean had been near the dyke at the edge of the field owned by Scott Dawson when he had been injured and, whilst bleeding, had made his way scrambling and not fully upright, down and along into the dyke where he was further injured. He died as a direct consequence of multiple injuries inflicted during a sustained assault. These injuries included multiple severe force blows delivered by way of one or more blunt instruments, such as a bar or similar object. He also may well have been kicked or stamped on. There were multiple severe injuries to his head. His skull was fractured and there was damage and hemorrhaging to his brain. He may well have been rendered unconscious during the attack. He had multiple rib fractures, severe bruising to his arm, and there was a fracture to his leg. A balaclava, on which Carol Dawson's DNA was detected, was discovered in a caravan used by Scott and Carol Dawson. The balaclava was found in a police search on the 22nd of November 2018. It was the prosecution's case that after the murder, Scott and Carol Dawson took the steps to conceal incriminating evidence. An example of this is on the 7th of September 2018. Carol Dawson was seen at her home address cleaning and hoovering the vehicle she had used on the 6th of September 2018, wearing pink washing up gloves, which she later lied in an interview about owning. Conversations between Scott and Carol Dawson, between them both at Carol Dawson's address, which were covertly recorded after they had been released from custody on the 9th of September 2018, along with other various handwritten notes which were recovered, tended to be incriminating in nature, although they did not contain any indication of involvement in any murder. For both Scott and Carol Dawson, who did not give evidence in the court, their case was that they had not been involved in the killing, and it was suggested that it was only circumstantial evidence which had failed to prove their guilt. It was suggested that the circumstantial evidence failed to prove their guilt, and the key assumptions made by the prosecution were unsupported by the evidence. So what are the grounds that Scott Dawson plans to appeal on? Scott Dawson's application for appeal went as follows. Scott Dawson does not seek in this application to dispute the jury's decision that he has been concerned in the killing of Gary Dean. His sole ground of appeal against conviction, advanced with the skill by Mr Ryder QC, is that the judge should have left the partial defence of loss of control. By way of introduction to this issue, we note that during the trial, evidence was given of Scott Dawson's quick and volatile temper. There was a history of occasion relied on by the Crown when he became angry with his neighbours, using foul language and threatening violence. Several individuals suggested at the trial that they felt they had been or felt threatened by Scott Dawson, and that Mr Dawson had directed foul language towards them, accompanied by threats of violence such as rip them to pieces, or he offered to fight them in the woods. On one occasion, he had pushed a neighbour in the chest, and he had shouted and sworn at a woman who had parked inappropriately. It is argued by Scott Dawson that Gary Dean had behaved which enticed Mr Dawson over a significant period of time, and it suggested that the fatal attack appears to have been frenzied in nature. The judge has been criticised in this appeal for not carefully analysing the distinct elements of the statutory test for loss of control in his ruling. It is also suggested that he failed to consider the particular circumstances of Mr Dawson, and that he misapplied what is described as the objective test. It is also suggested that the judge failed to assess the gravity of the overall effect of Gary Dean's behaviour, although it is accepted that the individual incidents were relatively trivial. They occurred with remorseless regularity, and it became very extreme by nature to their mental health. It is argued that the judge should not have been influenced by the self-control which was exercised by other individuals who were affected by Gary Dean's activities. In all circumstances, it was contended that the jury may have reasonably concluded that Scott Dawson lost control during the course of the encounter. However, in his ruling, the judge set out and explained his reasons for refusing to leave the defence of loss of control. In the context of this case, there are three elements having regard the issue of loss of control. First, there has to be evidence of a loss of control. There has to be a qualifying trigger, in other words, things that were said or done, perhaps over a period of time, in circumstances of an extremely grave character, which gave rise to a justifiable sense of being seriously wronged. In the terms of there being a loss of control, it is clear to me that there is evidence that a person who executed the killing of Mr Dean potentially was either out of control or acting with deliberate and considered violence. It was certainly one or the other out of the two. So to that extent, the limb of the defence is potentially made out. This is not the issue in this case. Even viewing matters entirely on the evidence, as I must, and interpreting that evidence as favourable as one reasonably could towards the viewpoint of Scott Dawson, I really question whether this defence has any mileage at all. There is no doubt the evidence establishes that Mr Dean was extremely irritating over a prolonged period of time. Certainly that is the conclusion the jury might be entitled to reach. This was all born from his seeming autism, which had not been in any way treated by the time with which we are concerned. Even if one accepts his conduct was acutely aggravating indeed, there is much evidence to reveal that he is acutely aggravating, not only to the Dawsons, but to a variety of people as well, many of whom have given evidence in the case as to his conduct and how they, as ordinary citizens, had reacted to him. Even if one accepts that someone like the Dawsons were entitled to take more than the usual steps that one might take when encountering an aggravating individual, again, one questions whether the circumstances were such and so grave a character to give rise to such a justifiable sense of being seriously wrong, for example, calling the police, being involved in court proceedings, and taking all the special measures that have asserted to being taken by the Dawsons in order to protect their property. For an individual with normal capacity of self-restraint and tolerance, unless the circumstances are extremely grave, normal irritation and even serious anger do not often cross the threshold for loss of control. In my judgment, the evidence in this case, viewing it as favourably as one can towards the position of Scott Dawson, he may well have been extremely irritated, but it does not cross, in my judgment, the threshold into the defence of loss of control. The circumstances giving rise to this must be extremely grave. In my judgment, even again looking at the matter as favourably as one can towards Scott Dawson, it does not come into that category at all, and the defendant's sense of being seriously wrong must be justifiable. In my judgment, that trigger is not in any way activated. There is, furthermore, evidence in the case that there was a potential here for the jury to conclude that this was all being pursued as a... In the result, I have come to the conclusion that, applying the law in this way that has been accurately set out in the written submissions of Mr. Ryder, this case does not in any way, shape or form come near to that which is required for the defence to be left to the jury. Accordingly, I have come to the conclusion that the defence of loss of control should not be left to the jury to decide, for the reasons which I have briefly, albeit perhaps imperfectly and somewhat infelicitously, indicated over the course of this judgment. As a result, the appeal judges have this to say about Scott Dawson's appeal. We stress the importance of a careful analysis by a judge of each of the three requirements for this partial defence, when deciding or not whether it should be left to a jury. The application of the provisions to the circumstances of the individual cases is not necessarily a straightforward exercise, and the evidence frequently requires detailed consideration. In the present case, we have no hesitation in concluding that there was insufficient evidence basis for leaving loss of control to the jury. This renewed application by Scott Dawson for leave of appeal is refused. Carol Dawson, who had also made an appeal, was represented by Mr Kent QC. Miss Dawson had appealed on the grounds that a judge had allowed the jury to hear evidence of finding a balaclava in a caravan on the 22nd of November 2018, almost 3 months after the murder. There was no evidential foundation for the admission of evidence. It is irrelevant and should be excluded. According to Mr Kent QC, it is irrelevant and it should be excluded. Its admission in the trial caused Carol Dawson's trial to be unfair, and as a result, her conviction is unsafe. Mr Kent QC emphasised in his oral submissions that there was no reason for those involved in this lethal attack to disguise themselves. Furthermore, he emphasises that it is not clear whether Carol Dawson was in the immediate vicinity of the assault when it occurred. He suggested that this very sinister object would have had a significant effect on the jury. The balaclava was found in the living area of the caravan, on the farm in which the applicant stayed sometimes, relatively close to the murder scene. DNA that matched Carol Dawson was also found inside the balaclava. Mr Kent QC submitted at trial that this piece of evidence should be excluded on the basis that it had no value. The Crown, however, in written submissions, contend that this was a relevant piece of evidence. Carol Dawson had worn a balaclava at some stage before it was found on the 22nd of November 2018. It is a garment that, by its design, is meant to conceal the wearer's identity and would be an unusual choice for a normal apparel for a 72-year-old woman. The attack took place during daylight, and it was logical to assume that those involved would have wished to conceal their identities. The judge ruled that the balaclava was relevant to an issue in the case. It was, the judge suggested, part of the backdrop. There had been violent and hostile exchanges between Mr Dean and Carol Dawson and Scott Dawson, which were closely connected with the farm. At the time of the murder, Carol Dawson was in a nearby lay-by and therefore in the thick of it. However, in the opinions of Mr Kent QC, it was not appropriate that the balaclava was used as a backdrop, and it was not placed with proper context or analysed with care. In the event, the judge reminded the jury where the balaclava had been found and the location of the DNA. Moreover, he summarised the Crown's allegation that Carol Dawson had acted as a lookout during these events and had worn the balaclava in order to disguise herself. The balaclava formed only a small part of a very substantial body of evidence that made up an essentially circumstantial case against Scott and Carol Dawson, in the context of other materials introduced by the prosecution throughout the trial. This included the discovery of a particular piece of clothing containing Carol Dawson's DNA. It was for the jury to decide what conclusions, if any, were to be drawn, but given the varied and significant elements of planning by Scott and Carol Dawson for the attack on Gary Dean, it was open to the jury to infer that it either formed part of the preparation for the attack or it had been worn by Carol Dawson during the events leading up to the killing of Gary Dean. It was not presented to the jury that the applicant had not been seen wearing the item. Instead, the overall circumstances rendered to its discovery in a caravan left the jury to decide whether it had been materially contributed to the case against one or both of Scott and Carol Dawson. Reviewing the case, the appeal courts had this to say about Carol Dawson. In any event, the discovery of the balaclava was only a small part of the overall material introduced during the course of this trial, and it was not given any particular prominence, including during the summing up. In all circumstances, Carol Dawson's conviction is not arguably unsafe as a result of the introduction of this piece of evidence. Scott and Carol Dawson both received mandatory life sentences. In the case of Scott Dawson, a minimum term of 31 years was imposed, and in the case of Carol Dawson, a minimum term of 26 years was imposed. For both Scott and Carol Dawson, there was an order that 179 days which were spent on remand should count against those terms. Both Scott and Carol Dawson have renewed the application for leave of appeal against the sentence, following the refusal by a single judge. Carol Dawson was born on the 30th of April 1947 and is now 73 years old. Scott Dawson was born on the 24th of January 1978 and will soon be 43. In Carol Dawson's case, an appeal against sentence may not affect her future, even if it succeeds. In Scott Dawson's case, it may very well do so. It is critical that the minimum terms are specified in accordance with proper principles and the terms of what is now Schedule 21 to the Sentencing Act of 2020. At the time of sentence, the relevant provisions were Schedule 21 to the Criminal Justice Act of 2003. In sentencing, the judge said that this was a jointly planned attack to kill Gary Dean. A firearm had been acquired and stored at Carol Dawson's home. Scott Dawson had taken the lead, armed with a powerful air rifle and a pole, had killed with a brutal determination. Carol Dawson had fully participated in the killing by encouraging and facilitating. Mr Dean had suffered a prolonged attack in which he was shot with an air rifle and he was beaten with weapons. He had been attacked, chased and attacked again, and had endured mental and physical suffering in the last few minutes of his life. Mr Dean was a much loved man and was vulnerable due to his autism, a factor in which the judge indicated would not overly aggravate the minimum term. Mr Dean, who on occasion had acted in an antisocial manner and irritated some people. However, he was not overly aggressive and would only confront when he knew he could retreat. Scott and Carol Dawson's desire for revenge came from the Dawsons' perception that the police were not doing anything, and having decided that their campaign of intimidation had failed. Scott and Carol Dawson decided to rid themselves of Mr Dean, as they believed he was halting the plans for the farm. After the killing, Scott and Carol Dawson sought to cover up their crime, cleaned up, destroyed evidence and lied to the police. The judge determined that the starting point for the minimum term, given the particularly high seriousness of each of Scott and Carol Dawson's criminality, was 30 years. In mitigation, neither had previous convictions, and Carol Dawson relied on her age and the fact that she was not an actual killer but a key participant. The defence of loss of control was subject to extensive argument at trial. It was clearly important that the sentencing exercise to make a determination as to the extent to which Mr Dawson or Mrs Dawson had been provoked. In the sentencing remarks, which were prepared with care and made available by the judge in a written form immediately after sentencing, the judge did not refer to this mitigating factor. He did make findings about the conduct of Mr Dean, which he described as involving an abnormal and an antisocial manner, when he did not appreciate the insensitivity and annoyance he caused some people. He recorded the fact the defendants had complained to the police about the deceased, and that there had been an unsuccessful prosecution of him, after which a restraining order had been made out against Mr Dean. The main bone of the contention appears to be the behaviour of Mr Dean on some forested land which adjoined the Dawsons' farmland, which included starting small fires opposite the Dawsons' land. The judge found that the trigger for the murder was Mr Dean's behaviour in starting another fire there on the 5th of September 2018. In summing up the issues for the jury, the judge had given more detail about the habitual behaviour of Mr Dean, which he described as aggressive and unpleasant. It does not appear from the sentencing remarks that he rejected the evidence that he was therefore summarising. The judge found that the correct starting point in the Schedule 21 range was the 30-year starting point, provided by paragraph 3 of the offences for seriousness, which were particularly high. 9 examples are given of cases which would normally fall within this category. The only one which is engaged here is murder involving the use of a firearm. This murder involved the use of a .22 air rifle to wound the victim before he was killed with another weapon. It was a powerful air rifle, capable of using heavy pellets for pest control. It was, however, legally held without any licence. It was not, perhaps, the kind of weapon Parliament had at the forefront of its mind when enacting paragraph 3 of Schedule 21. The use of a firearm is often a seriously aggravating feature of murder cases, because the murderer has been able to acquire a deadly weapon with ammunition, possession of which in itself carries a serious offence, and which is a marker for involvement in serious criminal behaviour beyond the murder in question. Those features are absent here. This is not to say that the use of the weapon is irrelevant, but only to question whether the case is truly attracted a starting point of 30 years. The weapon was certainly taken to the scene and used, and the issue is whether an increase above an already enhanced starting point of 25 years was required because the weapon was a non-lethal air rifle as opposed to a lethal knife or gun. That, of course, only affects the starting point and not the ultimate sentence, but the selection of a starting point is a significant part of the process of determining a minimum term. The judge also treated Mr Dean as being particularly vulnerable by reason of his autism. Undoubtedly, this was a relevant feature because it explained the antisocial behaviour to which Scott and Carol Dawson reacted to in such a calculated and wicked way. The evidence was that most people, once they knew why the deceased behaved as he did, found his conduct much easier to tolerate. Scott and Carol Dawson had wholly failed to react with this degree of humanity, and this aggravates their sentence. The Court of Appeal said, "It appears to us it is reasonably arguable that the selection of the 30-year starting point in this case gave undue prominence to the fact that an air rifle was used to inflict non-lethal force." The judge did not give any weight at all to the conduct of Mr Dean, which might arguably amount to the loss of control by Scott and Carol Dawson. The vulnerability of Mr Dean may have been given too much weight, and the minimum term of 31 years and 26 years were therefore manifestly excessive. The Court of Appeal therefore give leave to both applicants to appeal against their sentence. We note that the applicants have been represented by a counsel on private basis on these renewed applications. Scott Dawson does not wish for a representation order, whereas Carol Dawson does. We grant her application for a representation order, limited to leading counsel acting alone. Given the potential importance of the issue relating to the term to the use of a non-lethal firearm, thank you for joining us today. What are your opinions on the crimes that were committed by Scott and Carol Dawson? Do you believe they had took things too far with Mr Dean? Or do you believe that Mr Dean had pushed them to the edge and that they had acted out of loss of control? What are your opinions on the sentence? Do you believe that a term of 31 years and 26 years were excessive? Or do you believe they should have spent the rest of their life in jail? What are your opinions on the appeal process? Do you think that Carol Dawson or Scott Dawson will win an appeal to reduce their sentence? Please let us know in the comments below. Thanks for joining us today. If you enjoyed this content, please don't forget to like and share. And if you're new to the channel, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell so that you can join us for the next video. Thank you for joining us, and until next time, stay safe.